What's the dirty guilty pleasure encounter you enjoyed, but would never tell anyone? Story 1. Got my blow from a high school girlfriend under the blanket while her mom was working on the computer with her back to us, on the other side of the room. I've been chasing that same mix of fear and excitement for the past 20 years. Story 2. I met someone on Tinder, not exactly a model, but I wasn't either, so no judgment. We met up at a bar, had a few rounds, and eventually went back to her place. Things got heated quickly, but as I reached down, I discovered she had a prosthetic leg. She laughed it off and said she usually tells people up front. I was tipsy, a bit stunned, but didn't want to make her feel bad. So, I shrugged it off and we kept going. It was unexpected but oddly liberating. And no, I never told my friends. They'd never let me live it down, not because of her leg, but because they'd never believe I actually got lucky. Story 3. A bunch of co-workers, and I hit a bar in Silver Lake. I invited a co-worker and her cousin. The night got wild, drinks flowed, and my co-worker got handsy. We went back to my place since they couldn't drive. When I offered them the couch, they gave each other a look, and then one of them asked, "So, who are you picking?" I chose my co-worker. Halfway through, she changed her mind and told me to stop. I respected it, but later, I found her cousin still awake, and the vibe was different. We ended up hooking up. No protection, no regrets. Strange night, definitely not my proudest moment. Story 4. I met a girl online from Brazil who invited me over for drinks. She was petite, gorgeous, and surprisingly confident. Her roommate, a taller, curvier woman, joined us. As we sat chatting, my date suddenly leaned over and kissed me. Next thing I know, we're tangled up on the couch. Then her roommate joined in without a word. That night turned into a three-way I never saw coming. We stayed in touch for a while, but I couldn't keep up with their energy. They eventually moved back to Brazil. I still have no idea what sparked it all. Story 5. When I was 23, I met a 36-year-old woman at an art exhibit. She was stylish and had this melancholy charm. After a few dates, she confessed she had fertility struggles and was considering IVF. In a moment of impulsive sympathy, I offered to help the old-fashioned way. To my surprise, she agreed. We did it, no protection, and I never heard from her again. I sometimes wonder if I fathered a child that night. I didn't even catch her last name. It lives in the back of my mind like a question I'll never get answered. Story 6. During a trip to Chicago for a wedding, I arrived 2 days early due to a scheduling mix-up. With time to kill, I wandered into a cozy jazz bar. There I met a stylish woman in her 50s who was in town from Indiana. We hit it off, and she invited me back to her place. She was confident, passionate, and surprisingly into nerdy trivia. The next morning, her sister knocked on the door to pick her up and ended up staying for coffee. One thing led to another. Let's just say my hotel checkout was very late. That weekend aged me in the best way possible. Story 7. I went to a dealership to get my oil changed. While waiting, I struck up a flirtatious chat with a saleswoman, not a salesman. She offered to show me a few new models. During the test drive, we joked about self-defense classes and how I could probably take her down. She smirked and said, "Prove it." We ended up in the back seat of a parked car behind the service bay. She looked around nervously, then dared me to make it quick. I did. It was the most impromptu encounter of my life, and I still get a little flustered when I see that car model on the road. Story 8. While stationed in Guam, I decided to try a massage place with a buddy after a night of drinks. I stripped down completely, not realizing that was the unspoken cue for something extra. The masseuse, an older woman, gently offered a special finish. I hesitated, but the alcohol and the lack of action for months made me say yes. Afterward, I felt weirdly guilty. My friend, meanwhile, got a regular massage and was annoyed I didn't warn him. I never went back, but I still remember that awkward mix of pleasure and regret. Story 9. After my ex cheated on me, I ran into her best friend at a dive bar. She was sympathetic and very flirty. One drink led to another, and we ended up at her place. We hooked up for several weeks, and no one ever found out. They're still best friends, as far as I know. The irony? My ex once joked I'd never find someone better. She was half right. Story 10. At 18, I worked part-time at a copy center. One of the regulars, a 52-year-old woman, often chatted me up. One day, she said she had a headache and needed a ride home. I offered. At her place, she invited me in. One thing led to another. She was wild, confident, and oddly obsessed with asking what I'd tell my friends about her. I didn't tell anyone until now. Looking back, I'm pretty sure she faked the headache just to get me there. Story 11. When I was 21, I lived in my first apartment, and my girlfriend would visit often. With no roommates or parents around, we had complete privacy. One night, things got wild. So wild the headboard was slamming, and my girlfriend was letting out screams loud enough to earn us a visit from the police. After cooling off, I slipped an apology under my neighbor's door, offering my number in case we got too noisy again. She texted later, and we ended up chatting and laughing. Turns out she was 33 and recently divorced. A few days later, she invited me for dinner to clear the air. One glass of wine led to another, and that night, I experienced my first true older woman encounter. My girlfriend never found out, and to this day, I still wonder if she ever suspected. Story 12. I met someone online who had a vibrant personality. On our first date, she seemed shy about getting intimate. Eventually, she confessed she hadn't shaved in a while, not just her legs, but everywhere. I shrugged and said I didn't mind. What I didn't expect was how much I'd actually enjoy it. She had a full, natural look that was unlike anything I'd encountered. We ended up being together for about a year until she moved to Germany for grad school. We kept in touch briefly, but time and distance got in the way. I still think about her sometimes. It changed what I'm attracted to. Even now, I prefer partners who embrace their natural selves. Story 13. A man on a dating app offered me $400 for a fully clothed massage. I was broke and intrigued, so I agreed. At his spa, he asked me to lie face down while he used only his hands, never even touched anything explicitly sexual. Still, I ended up reaching the finish line more than once. It was surreal. He wasn't hot, but he knew what he was doing. I left stunned, richer, and more confused than I've ever been. I never saw him again, but that memory lives in a strange little corner of my brain that I've never unpacked. Story 14. While stationed in Korea, I hooked up with a local girl I met at a karaoke bar. We got a room at one of those themed motels, and it was fine, nothing legendary. Afterward, I walked back toward the club and ran into a fellow soldier from my unit, the one we all secretly crushed on. We got food, talked for hours, and eventually ended up back at the same motel. Yep, twice in one night, same place. The front desk clerk raised an eyebrow but said nothing. That second round? Absolutely unforgettable. We never brought it up again, but we shared a knowing look each time we passed in the hall. Story 15. I work in a hospital, and one of the nurses from another department started dropping by my office more often. It began innocently, sharing snacks, joking around, until one day she locked the door behind her. We had a quick, intense session against the filing cabinet. Ever since, if we're ever alone, we can't keep our hands off each other. We've done it in bathrooms, supply closets, even the break room once. Outside of that, we have nothing in common. It's purely physical. But it's the kind of thing you don't tell anyone, because they'd never believe you anyway. Story 16. I was 25, and she was 18, a new intern at my job. She was smart, mature, and a bit sarcastic. We developed a sibling-like dynamic, but over time it shifted. I helped her set up her first apartment, gave her advice about college, and spent more time with her than I probably should have. On her 19th birthday, she kissed me after everyone else had left the party. Nothing happened beyond that, but the emotional intensity of that moment still lingers. We stayed friends, but I always wondered what might have been if I hadn't held back. Story 17. I met a woman at a science networking event. She was a microbiologist, but once we started dating, her beliefs became, well, wild. She thought ancient civilizations had tech more advanced than ours, and that the moon landing was filmed underwater. I was fascinated, skeptical, turned on, and confused all at once. Her passion was overwhelming, in every context. We had incredible chemistry, even though we couldn't agree on anything except physical contact. After about a month, I ended things. But the memory of being with someone so wildly different from me still makes me wonder what I would have missed if I hadn't taken that leap. Story 18. One summer, I worked construction in Vancouver. Every morning, I'd see this woman walk by in workout gear, always smiling at me. I never had the nerve to speak to her. On my last week at the site, I finally did. Her name was Danny, and we hit it off immediately. That weekend, we went on a hike, but when we got back to her place, things got heated. I was nervous and clumsy, but she was patient and kind. We dated for a couple of months before she moved to Toronto. We still follow each other on Instagram, but that summer romance was the real thing, even if it didn't last. Story 19. After a rough few months of being homeless in Oregon, I ran into an old acquaintance from my street days. She had been part of a group that once jumped me, which made things awkward. But she apologized, and we ended up having tacos and drinks. That night, she came back to the budget motel I was staying in, and we ended up hooking up. It was intense in a way only survival stories can be. We never saw each other again, but that moment of connection stood out in a time when everything else felt unstable. Story 20. Years after high school, I ran into the older brother of a girl who used to bully me. He was surprisingly charming, and we flirted at a party before heading back to his place, which turned out to be the same house I used to visit for school projects. We hooked up in the basement, the same place his sister once threw a drink on me during a sleepover. The irony wasn't lost on me. I never said a word to anyone, but every time I think about that night, I get a little smirk on my face. Story 21. At 18, I attended my grandfather's funeral. My college partner had come along to support me. Emotions were raw, and the heaviness in the air made everything feel surreal. At one point, we slipped into a storage room near the chapel to catch our breath. The quiet turned into comfort, and comfort turned into something physical. It was impulsive, clumsy, and completely out of place, but for some reason, it eased the emotional pressure. Small Blue Diamond Story 22. When I was 19, I decided to explore something bold. I found an escort named Roxy through a website and met her in a quiet motel. She was nothing like I'd imagined, witty, tall, and surprisingly maternal. We ended up talking more than expected, and she drove us to a 24-hour grocery store to grab snacks. That's when I saw my cousin walk in. I ducked, panicked, and bolted out the back. Roxy thought it was hilarious. We went back to the motel and had one of the most oddly comforting nights of my life. Story 23. I travel for work and always make time for a sauna. While in Amsterdam, I found one listed as clothing optional. I didn't think much of it until I walked in and realized it was a gay cruise sauna. I nearly turned around, but curiosity got the better of me. I ended up chatting with a guy who was a local historian, oddly enough. We talked for over an hour before things turned physical in one of the darker corners. It was my first time with a man, and it unlocked a part of myself I didn't know existed. I haven't repeated the experience, but I left with more self-awareness than I expected. Story 24. A few years after a breakup, I hit a jack-in-the-box while hungover with my cousin. Inside, I ran into my ex's cousin, someone I always had casual banter with. She was in rough shape, recently laid off, and living temporarily at a nearby extended-stay hotel. We got to talking, and I offered her a ride. We ended up hanging out at her place, reminiscing and smoking. Hours later, things got physical. It was messy, impulsive, and completely unexpected. I haven't seen her since, but every time I drive by that jack-in-the-box, I wonder if she still remembers. Story 25. When I was 23, I worked for a company with a very charismatic boss in her 40s. She invited the team over for a Sunday barbecue. As the night wound down, her husband put on 80s rock and jokingly suggested a dance-off. Everyone left except me and them. What started as fun turned into something more when they invited me to stay for drinks. They asked, subtly but clearly, if I'd be open to a new experience. Before I could overthink it, things escalated. We ended up in their bedroom, and I found myself in a situation I'd only read about. It happened a few more times before I changed jobs. We parted on good terms, and with a lot of memories. Story 26. Senior year, I was at a sleepover with a few close friends. After everyone fell asleep, I stayed up talking with one of the girls I'd grown especially close to. We were lying side by side, chatting about crushes and college plans. Out of nowhere, she admitted she'd never kissed anyone. I asked if she wanted to try. She leaned in. It was soft and slow, and felt incredibly innocent. One thing led to another, and we quietly explored each other under the covers, just feet away from our sleeping friends. We never spoke of it again, but I think about it more than I probably should. Story 27. I was seeing a woman who was always up for experimenting. One night, she invited me to join her in the shower. I expected steamy fun, but she told me to sit down, then proceeded to urinate on me. I was stunned but didn't say anything in the moment. To my surprise, it triggered a wave of unexpected arousal. I'd never been into anything like that before, and haven't since, but that night broke something open in me. Even now, I can't quite explain it. We dated briefly after that, but nothing ever matched the strange intensity of that shower moment. Story 28. I ran into my ex's sister at a barbecue. We talked, laughed, and shared a few drinks. She hugged me tight when we said goodbye, and I felt something shift. A week later, she texted and asked if I wanted to hang out. I hesitated, then agreed. We ended up kissing, then more. It wasn't about revenge or closure. It was just two people who knew each other well enough to skip the awkwardness. It only happened once, but it left a strange mix of guilt and peace. We never told anyone. We didn't need to. Story 29. After my ex and I broke up, I kept in touch with her mom. She'd always been warm and funny. One afternoon, I bumped into her at a bookstore. We got coffee and talked for hours. There was a strange tension in the air, like something unspoken had been simmering for years. That night, she invited me over to help rearrange her patio furniture. We ended up in her living room instead. It only happened a few times, quietly, and then we stopped. No drama, no fallout. Just a secret kept between us, one I still think about when I pass that bookstore. Story 30. I was casually seeing a woman who worked children's parties. Face paint, balloon animals, the whole thing. One evening, I dropped by after she got home from a gig. She was still in full clown makeup, and we were sitting on the couch when she climbed into my lap. Her roommate, dressed like a fairy princess, sat nearby watching TV, seemingly oblivious. We didn't say a word. We just quietly did our thing under a blanket, while cartoons played in the background. It was ridiculous, surreal, and oddly thrilling. I still laugh every time I see a clown now. Story 31. At 19, I met someone through an online forum who I assumed was close to my age. When I arrived at her apartment, I realized she was at least in her late 30s and significantly heavier than her photos suggested. I was too polite or too stunned to leave. We chatted, and she suddenly leaned in and kissed me. Not long after, things turned physical. She ended up going down on me, and to my surprise, wouldn't stop. I had to ask her to pause after the third round. It was getting painful. She laughed and said, "I just like doing a thorough job." It was awkward, intense, and unforgettable. We never spoke again. Story 32. One Friday night, a girl I'd been messaging came over. We hooked up, and she left the next afternoon. I hadn't even cleaned up before heading out with a friend. At a local pub, a woman approached me and made it clear she was interested. She ended up coming home with me. When she tried to go down on me, I warned her I hadn't showered. She just smirked and said, "All the better." That night was wild. 2 hookups within 24 hours, no sleep and no filter. I don't usually live like that, but that weekend stands out like a neon sign in my memory. Story 33. In my senior year, I had a bit of a crush on my English teacher. She was young, sharp, and had this quiet charisma. On the last day of school, I helped her carry supplies to the attic for storage. While we were up there, she suddenly leaned in and kissed me. I was stunned but kissed her back. Things escalated quickly, and she gave me a blowy right there, in the dusty attic surrounded by boxes of old textbooks. Years later, I ran into her at a grocery store. She was with her husband and didn't recognize me at all. I just smiled and walked past. Story 34. A coworker and I had always had great work vibes, banter, shared playlists, inside jokes. One night, after a long shift, we went to grab drinks and shoot pool. After a few beers, she invited me over. We watched a movie, and by the time the credits rolled, we were tangled up on her couch. She was surprisingly assertive and kept asking me to be rougher. It lasted for hours. The next day at work, she acted like nothing happened. We never did it again, but every time we lock eyes during meetings, there's a flicker of something unspoken. Story 35. Soon after breaking up with my girlfriend, I ran into her best friend's younger sister at a college house party. She gave me a long look and said, "You're single now, right?" We ended up hooking up in a parked car just off campus. It was messy and intense, and her hair was wild when she stepped out to head back home. Later, I found out my ex showed up at her house minutes after I dropped her off. She asked what was going on, and the sister just said she'd been out with someone. My ex never found out. We hooked up 2 more times before calling it off for good. Story 36. During a rough patch in my long-distance relationship, I downloaded Tinder mostly out of boredom. I matched with someone nearby and ended up getting a blowy in a Wendy's parking lot. It was impulsive and reckless, but it gave me the clarity to finally end things with my girlfriend. I didn't confess until months later. That whole situation spiraled into a rough breakup and some poor choices involving alcohol. But I got through it. I'm now happily married, and I look back on that night not with pride, but with recognition. That moment forced me to grow up. Story 37. At a friend's wedding, I met a bridesmaid who was clearly into me. The reception turned into a blur of dancing and champagne. Around midnight, she pulled me into a side hallway and kissed me. We snuck into a coat closet and did it right there, surrounded by dress shoes and winter jackets. I barely remember the vows, but I'll never forget that closet. We never exchanged numbers, and I don't even remember her name. But I definitely remember the shoes falling off the shelf mid-moment. Story 38. While attending a summer program, I got close to a TA, technically not a professor, but old enough to be one. She was sharp, sarcastic, and beautiful. After a seminar, she asked if I wanted to grab coffee somewhere quiet. We ended up at her place. Books were stacked everywhere, and jazz was playing in the background. She poured wine, and things got intimate fast. She kept whispering poetry quotes between kisses. It was like sleeping with someone straight out of a novel. She left the country a month later for a research grant. We never spoke again. I still have the book she lent me. Story 39. During college, I tutored a guy in his mid-20s who was going back to school after years in the workforce. He was charming, charismatic, and always flirted lightly. One night, after a study session, he asked if I wanted to grab a drink. We ended up in his apartment. He played me some old jazz records and asked me to dance. I laughed but agreed. One song turned into two, and soon we weren't dancing anymore. We dated briefly, but the age gap started to feel weird. Still, that first night was unbelievably electric. Story 40. When I was living in a duplex, my neighbor's wife would often wave from across the driveway. We made polite small talk, nothing more. One evening, when her husband was away on a work trip, she knocked on my door asking if I could help her with her Wi-Fi. I came over, fixed the router, and as I was about to leave, she kissed me. We ended up hooking up in her laundry room on a pile of clean towels. It only happened once, and we never acknowledged it again. Every time I saw her after that, she just smiled like nothing happened. Story 41. A year after I moved out of my hometown, I bumped into a girl I briefly dated in high school. We exchanged pleasantries, and she invited me to a small backyard get-together. I didn't expect much, but after a few drinks and shared stories, we ended up in her childhood bedroom, still covered in posters of boy bands. The nostalgia added a strange kind of intimacy to the moment. The next morning, her younger brother, who used to idolize me, walked in without knocking. We froze. He just stared, blinked, and said, "Huh," then closed the door. We never talked again. Story 42. I drove for a rideshare app in my early 20s. One night, I picked up a woman in her 40s who had clearly had a few drinks. She flirted casually, then asked if I wanted to come up for coffee. I hesitated but agreed. Inside her penthouse, she poured wine instead. The night took a turn when she asked if I'd ever been with someone older. I hadn't. She guided everything. No pressure, just confidence. When I left, she tipped me $100 through the app with the note. "Thanks for the ride," pun intended. I never picked her up again, but I always checked for her name in the queue. Story 43. During my first real internship, I worked late one evening with the department's admin, an older woman with sharp heels and a sharper wit. We were organizing files when the office door accidentally locked behind us. We waited for security to come, but the tension got heavy. She eventually leaned against the desk and said, "Well, we may as well kill time." One thing led to another, and we ended up doing it right there on the copy machine. When the guard finally unlocked the door, we were fully dressed, pretending to be frustrated about the wait. She winked at me the next morning, and we never mentioned it again. Story 44. I worked at a summer camp during college. One of the other counselors had been dating someone long distance, and one night while we were on break duty, she confessed she didn't think her relationship would last. She asked if I'd ever kiss someone just to forget someone else. I shrugged. She kissed me. We ended up hooking up in the arts and crafts shed. There were glitter and pipe cleaners everywhere. The next day, she acted like nothing happened, but she left a drawing in my cubby, 2 stick figures holding hands in a canoe. I kept it for years. Story 45. After a stressful client meeting, I was walking to my car in a dimly lit garage when a coworker caught up with me. We'd always had chemistry but never acted on it. She asked if I had a lighter, even though she didn't smoke. I handed it over, and she leaned in close. "You know, we've both been thinking about it," she whispered. Less than a minute later, we were pressed up against the concrete wall next to my car. It was fast, chaotic, and completely silent except for the occasional echoing footsteps. We drove away separately. Never happened again. Story 46. In grad school, a visiting lecturer gave a talk on Renaissance poetry, and I was hooked. Not just by the content, but by her confidence and voice. After the session, we talked about metaphors and ended up grabbing coffee. She invited me to her hotel to continue the discussion. Spoiler, we didn't talk about poetry much longer. She was mid-40s, divorced, and full of stories. We had a brief 2-week fling while she was in town. She left me a signed copy of her book with a note. Thanks for the inspiration. I still have it. Story 47. At a Halloween party, I dressed as a vampire. A woman there was dressed as a nurse, and we hit it off quickly. We danced, laughed, and eventually slipped away to a guest room. We barely got out of our costumes in time. The next morning, I realized she was the sister of a guy I used to play basketball with. She recognized me, but didn't say anything. We never saw each other again, but every year when I see Halloween decorations, I think of that night, and my fake fangs on her nightstand. Story 48. During a long layover in Denver, I struck up a conversation with a woman at the airport bar. She was headed to a conference, and I was on my way to visit family. We had a couple of drinks, then realized we were at the same hotel, different floors. Back at the lobby, she invited me up to finish our drink. We didn't finish the drink. We spent the night wrapped in each other. No numbers were exchanged. The next morning, she left a sticky note on my suitcase. Thanks for making this layover fly by. That was it. Story 49. In college, I took a night sculpting class. There was a model who posed regularly, tall, statuesque, confident. One evening after class, I stayed behind to clean up. She was still there, changing behind a curtain. She peeked out and asked if I had a towel. I handed one over, and she stepped out, still topless. I froze. She smirked and said, "You've already seen all of it. Why so shy now?" We ended up hooking up on one of the workbenches. Clay got everywhere. I dropped the class 2 weeks later, but never forgot that night. Story 50. Living in a shared apartment in Brooklyn, I often went to the rooftop to clear my head. One night, I found my neighbor up there with wine and a blanket. She invited me to sit. We talked about books, bad dates, and the city. Eventually, she leaned in, and we kissed. Under the warm glow of streetlights and a smoggy sky, we hooked up right there on the rooftop. It wasn't comfortable, but it was unforgettable. The next day, she slid a note under my door that said, "Let's pretend last night was a dream." But what a dream!